Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm the Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University. We're pleased to welcome you back to the Right City Conference. This is day 2. This year, our focus is to have discussions on human rights in the digital age. And we're really pleased on behalf of all our partners to bring together some of the world's top experts on these issues that governments, NGOs, the UN are struggling to wrap their heads around and find solutions. So I just want to say on behalf of my institute and my colleagues, but also the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the Department for National Defense, the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, the American Embassy to Canada, the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Canada, the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes Network, and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. These are all the partners that came together to help make this happen. I'd like to thank them for supporting this and engaging in a crucial discussion that we need to understand what's happening in the digital world and how it impacts humanitarian operations and the protection of civilians. So I'm very pleased to pass this on to our moderator, Megan Roberts, who's with the UN Foundation, to have a discussion on the case for a digital Geneva Convention, which has been really growing in recent years. So with that to do, I'd like to pass the floor to Megan and ask her to introduce the guests and take the conversation from there.
Thanks so much, Kyle, and thanks so much to all of you tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're tuning in. As Kyle mentioned, I'm Megan Roberts, Director of Policy Planning at the UN Foundation, and I'm delighted to be here today to moderate what I'm sure will be a fascinating and really all too timely conversation as part of Right City 2021 on the case for a digital Geneva Convention. This idea, as many of you will know, was initially proposed by Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, in 2017. And in his proposal, he wrote, "The time has arrived to call on the world's governments to implement international rules to protect the civilian use of the internet. Just as the 4th Geneva Convention has long protected civilians in times of war, we now need a digital Geneva Convention that will commit governments to protecting civilians from nation-state attacks in times of peace." Smith's proposal came in 2017 as the world was still reeling from the harms caused by a number of massive cyber attacks, including NotPetya, which was one of, if not the most damaging cyber attack the world has ever seen. And the idea, as Kyle mentioned, of a digital Geneva Convention is really receiving a lot more attention recently as so much of our lives has moved online in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we become more dependent on digital than ever. And during this time, we've also seen a surge in cyber attacks against individuals, companies, governments, and even the medical and research facilities working to end the pandemic. Our conversation comes soon after the conclusion of 2 parallel processes at the UN on cybersecurity, the Open-Ended Working Group and the Group of Government Experts, which this year reaffirmed norms related to the responsible behavior of states in cyberspace. Our conversation also comes a week ahead of the first formal open discussion on cybersecurity in the UN Security Council. And it comes as organizations are developing new approaches to protecting civilians from harms in the digital sphere, like the recently announced Advisory Board on Digital Threats, established by the International Committee of the Red Cross, where one of our panelists previously served as Director General. And it comes on the very day that Presidents Biden and Putin are meeting in Geneva, with cyber attacks at the top of the agenda for discussion. And in the lead up to this summit, even more attention has been focused on this idea of a digital Geneva Convention. So we couldn't have better timed this discussion, and we really could not have a better group of experts to walk us through the proposal for a digital Geneva Convention and the questions that it raises. Because of time pressure, I won't be able to go through our panelists' extensive and very impressive biographies. So I'll just give a quick introduction of each of our experts. I'm joined today by Stéphane Dugan. Stéphane is the Chief Executive Officer of the Cyber Peace Institute. We're also joined by Yves Decourt. Yves is a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And he was previously, as I mentioned, the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we're also joined by Anna Badushki. Anna is an associate professor at the University of Exeter, an associate research fellow at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. So I really appreciate these incredible experts being with us here today. And before we move forward, just a quick note on how we plan to spend the hour. I'll shortly give the floor to each of our panelists to offer 5 minutes of opening remarks. I'll then engage our panel in a discussion before opening up to questions from our audience, from all of you tuning in. So please be thinking about your questions for our experts now, and you can type them into the chat boxes on Facebook or YouTube or however you're tuning in today. But now I'm really pleased to invite our panelists to take the floor and offer some initial reflections on this proposal for a digital Geneva Convention. So Stefan, let's start with you.
Thank you very much for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me well. Opening remarks, I will keep them short in the sense of what is it that we are trying to solve when we are talking about potential Geneva Convention? What's the issue at stake? I guess to start with, it's a problem of escalation of malicious behavior and the responsibility of states when it comes to this escalation. Interestingly, you may have seen that in the latest draft report for the UN group for government experts, there's a specific mention that the states put together, which is an ambition to reduce the operating space for terrorists and criminals online. And that's a noble ambition. But what about reducing the operating space for malicious behavior by states online? I think that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about the fact that states have the obligation by international law to have a behavior that is transparent and predictable online. And when their online activities are part of a conflict, everything that is done there is falling under international law. You think international humanitarian law, human rights law. I mean, it's there. It's agreed and endorsed. And this leads to a specific gap today that whatever idea we have here should aim to solve. It's a problem of accountability. It's the difference in between the theory of the rules of the road and what is the reality of your driving. What is exactly happening today in the cyberspace? And is there any documentation or any measurements of what states are really doing and not doing in order to make sure that cyber peace, that's what we are defending in the Cyber Peace Institute, that cyber peace, meaning a state of play for you and I, everyone, to enjoy security, dignity, and equity in the cyberspace exists. And that's the responsibility of states. So it's about making sure that the system allows for accountability, that all the norms that have been set out for years are implemented, and we can measure how much they implemented. So it's about walking the talk. And that at the end of the day, whatever is decided is not for the sake of states to protect themselves against people, but it's for people to get the necessary protection from states. That would be my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Such a helpful landscaping to help us understand, where this proposal sits and how it might respond to some of the security challenges we see online, and really what the goal should be. Anna, I'd like to turn to you next.
Thank you. And thank you indeed for the invitation and the opportunity to be discussing this very topical subject with our panelists. I would like to put forward three main observations here. First of all, as Stefan has mentioned just now, cyber operations do not occur in a legal vacuum, and cyberspace is not a lawless space. It was reaffirmed by the two UN-based processes on responsible behavior of states in cyberspace, the OEWG and the GGE recently, that international law applies to cyberspace. That means that all the established bodies of international law, such as international humanitarian law, international human rights law, apply to cyberspace, and states have obligations arising from these bodies of law. So first of all, if we're thinking about developing and understanding how a digital Geneva Convention would fit into this legal landscape, it would be interesting to think more about how it would interact with the already existing bodies of international law that already apply to cyberspace. I think that's one of the first considerations. That leads me to a second consideration, which is that we need to clarify the exact material scope of this Digital Geneva Convention. Potentially, would that be to protect against attacks or cyber attacks, or focusing specifically on infrastructure, on critical infrastructure, or would it be to be limiting the use of cyber weapons or cyber operations against civilians? Or would it be more broad, as I think that was a bit the point in 2017-18, to protect individuals against harms in the digital space. And so here we could be asking ourselves whether these definitions and this object and purpose of this treaty would be too narrow or too broad. Because if we're thinking about all things digital, and we know that there is a crucial development in new technologies, in emerging technologies that also have an impact on established democratic processes, on the rule of law, and on our human rights on the digital space. So then this term digital could be seen as a very broad term. So we need to think about it in a way in which it would be more appropriate. And then thirdly, with that in mind, with these two considerations in mind, we will need to see whether there is an appetite amongst states to negotiate and adopt a new treaty, and what would be the consequences for that. So we're seeing at the domestic level at the moment the adoption of binding rules, a movement towards more adoption and calls for adoption of binding rules regarding technology, especially AI, artificial intelligence. And we're seeing also the emergence of norms concerning certain aspects of the use of cyber operations concerning, in particular, critical infrastructure, such as hospitals, for example. So does it mean that we're having a consensus emerging in international level, at the international level, that could lead to the adoption of this treaty? This is something that would need to be considered. And at the same time, what would be the risks there to have a new treaty that could perhaps end up with a less protective treaty than the ones that already exist? So all of these would need to be taken into account, and it's a fascinating topic. I'll stop there and be happy to continue the discussions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Excellent framing remarks, and lots to dig in there, including on the existing landscape and how a digital Geneva Convention would interact with what we have in our existing protections and frameworks. I'll turn now to Yves to offer some opening reflections.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be with you. I just wanted to start from the Geneva Convention, in fact, because I've been triggered, of course, and I was quite fascinated by, at the time, the fact that Brad Smith from Microsoft was coming with this idea. And for me, my first reflections was, why? He's coming from the private sectors and using, in fact, somewhat state definitions about an issue that was also challenging, because he also brought the peace notion, right, at the time. So I also thought, first thing is, we see that, in fact, private sectors are more and more challenged by, in fact, cyber attack, and Stefan mentioned that, and they, I think, feel also that they are under pressure, and they need not just to think about what they do, but they think about their customer, and they start to realize they might not be in a position to protect the customer. So that I was happy that somewhat he was talking about the Geneva Conventions. My point too is related to my own experience. I've worked quite some years at the ICSC, and I'm somebody who believes deeply that the Geneva Convention works. And I just would like to make a connection between our Geneva Convention right now. Of course, there is a lot of tensions. Of course, their interpretation in the field sometimes is difficult. Of course, they are related in Yemen, in Syria, in Ukraine, in Somalia. But at the same time, they are our common grammar. They really unite us in the understanding of what are we talking about. And I think we should never, ever forget how important it is in terms of clarify what it means. What are we talking when we talk about protection? What are we talking when we talk about civilian? What are we talking about when we talk about proportionality? All that is absolutely critical. So I think the ambition to have something similar for issues related to cyber attacks, cyber war is something absolutely critical. So I think I value these ambitions. Now, of course, maybe the questions, and Stefan and Anna mentioned that, is then there is this beauty of having these ambitions to have somewhat a common framework, a common language. Now, of course, if you start to look at the practicalities of it, that is then a bit difficult. The first worry I do have when we talk about the case for Geneva Convention, there is an immediate tensions, and somewhat when you talk about new treaty, new framework, the message is the existing doesn't work. There is no rules, there is nothing. And we've seen since 15 years how risky it is when you are moving in the area, when you say, no, the international public law do not work. No, and Stefan mentioned it, Anna mentioned it again. I think the international humanitarian law, if we look at the war specifically, works. And we do at the ICSC at the time, and still today, consider it absolutely as a framework, a legal framework that apply absolutely when it comes to cyber attack and cyber war. And I think there is a lot of normative, in fact, norms around, and I think we should be very careful when we start to play with the idea of a new treaty, because there's always immediately attentions about, okay, so it means that what is there with us doesn't work. Whereas it's very rarely the framework that is a problem, but it's the implementation, it's the accountability, it's the transparency around it. My second point is, and here I'm slightly more radical than Anna, I think the time is not ripe. I think we need to be careful. I think there is major issues, and not just one, a lot of issues when it comes to the cyber question in general, and especially the cyber collective. But I think we need to be aware that we don't want now to start to put all our energy trying to mobilize states, because it will have to be a state-led, in fact, initiatives. And we know it will be a super heavy diplomatic process. We know we're in a world where polarization is really, really there with us, with a very major, I would say, sovereignty discussions, or it will be very complicated. And I agree with Anna, a lot of things are happening at the national and at local level, but I've not seen really, let's say, an appetite for having something which could be similar to Geneva Conventions. And only when you have an appetite, it's very rare in history, it's only after a major shock. And so far, I've not seen maybe this major shock that leads us to that. My last point is, okay, what do we do with that? Okay, great idea, the Geneva Convention, digital Geneva Convention, but practically not really. And I think here, maybe that's what we will explore together. But I think here, maybe the 2 or 3 elements that I would like to put on the table quickly. Private sector. This is something we need to maintain. I think the fact that we have technology, big tech companies that are willing to enter in this arena, are willing to be somewhat being part of a really a response is something which is critical. There will be nothing without them. So we need to make them somewhat be part of that. And that is clearly for me the legacy of the Microsoft gesture. He is ready, Brad Smith and Microsoft, to somewhat jump into the area. And I think we need to make sure that we maintain that. I think the point too is, for me, is we need to unpack the issue. We can't just go at the global level, at the global framework. That sounds extremely difficult. And we need to unpack the issue in order to be specific about what issues are we trying to resolve. And last but not least, I think our compass really should be about the people, as always. But it's good to remember that we are not just trying now to manage, in fact, power dynamic between states, as a lot of people have talked these days with this Biden-Putin discussions, for example, also the last decision of NATO. No, it's not about that. If we're serious, and this is what we're discussing right now, it's about protecting, in fact, the people affected by war, affected by cyber attack, and how do we do that? I think that should really guide us and should help us to be very concrete about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yves, and a number of just really important points to have front and center in this conversation. Particularly your last one around putting people at the center, putting civilians and individuals at the center. Thanks so much to all of you for setting us up so nicely for the rest of our discussion here. Many points. I'm going to take advantage of moderator's privilege and ask our panelists a few questions, but we're really eager to make this an interactive conversation. So please, start entering your questions in the chat box, and we'll work to get as many of them as we can in the hour. But while we wait for those questions to come rolling in, Stefan, I want to turn to you first with a question about the risk landscape. You talked about this in your opening remarks, but the Cyber Peace Institute works to advance peace and justice in cyberspace. Can you talk a bit about some of the recent trends your organization is seeing and, expectations and sort of forecasts looking ahead. What do you see as the most pressing cyber challenges, and what are the vulnerabilities that really keep you and your colleagues awake at night?
Well, thank you. To give a bit of context there, so Cyber Peace Institute has been set up quite recently at the end of 2019, and in fact, it was in a direct follow-up of Brad Smith's call for Digital Geneva Convention, and the Institute has been set up to be independent and neutral in Geneva to document and measure attacks, what is happening to people. Our interest is what is happening to people, the societal impact of attacks, but then putting these attacks in the context of what is the ecosystem of norms and law in which these attacks are happening. That's very important to always link the two, because what we want to do is that for the victims or the targets of attack, to really have the information to obtain redress, to obtain repair, and to obtain justice. Otherwise, we're just talking about it, and it's very difficult to do anything. So practically speaking, what we did is to focus on what was happening in the healthcare. And to answer your question, I think it's good to look into the trends of healthcare for the past year. So in the context of a pandemic, when this critical infrastructure was, I don't need to explain why, needed by everyone in the world, there's been a rise in attack. At the peak of the pandemic, I was mentioning this earlier, we could document one attack per day in March 2020, and all type of attacks. And that's why it's important when you map the landscape, is to understand that from the victim point of view, it's not really important who is attacking you. What is important is that you're under attack. It can be a criminal group, it can be a state-sponsored actor, it can be a state actor, it can be a blend of disinformation in between a criminal group that is working for a state. I mean, it's at the end of the day, you're impacted. And we could see for the healthcare that they were facing ransomware. So a huge surge in ransomware. I mean, there was a 45% increase in ransomware against the healthcare when it was only 20% in other fields. And ransomware not only to cripple hospitals in order, to make them in a position that they have no choice than to pay ransom, but also more importantly to steal the data that hospital infrastructure we're hosting, because the patient data are very, very valuable on the dark market. So you can think that this data are much more valuable than financial data. It's a peak of $350 per patient data and an average of $250. This type of attack was blended with other type of attack with cyber espionage, and that was going much more into the fields of states, attacking the healthcare in order to steal data, but for other means. It's like stealing data in order to get an advantage from on a rival for geopolitical intent. And then last type of attack was disinformation campaign that could be linked with cyber attacks. So European Medical Agency, an attack in order to steal data and then modify the data to build a disinformation campaign. So the issue when it comes to the trends of the threat is that it's evolved very, very fast. Ransomware is just a business model that evolves every day. And at the end of the day, the victims, they still have the same little capacity to defend themselves. And to go back to this discussion, what are states today doing, practically speaking, to make sure that victims, at the end of the day, can have the tools that they need to obtain this justice and repair?
Thanks so much, Stefan. That's incredibly helpful. I mean, the surge in 45% surge in ransomware attacks against healthcare facilities, against 20% of surge of attacks more broadly is really striking. And your point about the very fast, this threat landscape evolving very quickly is an important one for us to keep in mind, especially against the long-term process of establishing, new laws, new treaties, and new conventions. With this sense of the threats and the risks in mind, and building on some of the comments that you made earlier, I want to dig a little bit deeper on, some of the existing norms, some of the protections, and what that would mean in the context of a Digital Geneva Convention. So what elements would the Digital Geneva Convention entail in terms of the development and deployment of cyber operations by nation states? And are there other, we talked about this a little bit already, but can you speak more about other established norms and conventions that might influence the content of the convention and just the regulation more broadly of cyberspace?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. And here, I believe we need to distinguish between two scenarios. So we have the development and the deployment of cyber capabilities in the context of an armed conflict, or with a view of using during armed conflict. And here we would have the international humanitarian law that would apply, and there are a number of specific rules that would be quite helpful on that, including Article 36 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention. That's one part. But however, as Stefan was saying a while ago, the majority of the situations in which we would have cyber operations and cyber attacks, they may occur outside of an armed conflict, so in peacetime. And here, there is a variety of international rules and norms that may apply. And I believe that too much of this debate since 2017-18 has been held too much in the context of this military or IHL, so international humanitarian law, uses of that. And the discourse now has been shifting more from the law of war to peacetime events. And here we would need to have a look at other areas. And one key point of interaction that we would have here is with international human rights law. And if we're thinking about again, developing a digital Geneva Convention that would be adopted in a multilateral context to protect individuals, vulnerable populations, we may need to think about the impact that it would have on human rights, and whether the existing norms and rules of human rights aren't already enough to go in this sense, because states have obligations under international human rights law to protect and ensure the protection and respect the rights of these individuals. So I think it's something to be taken into consideration. And then, as Eve has rightly pointed out, there is an important part that is played by the technology industry itself. And so here, again, norms that are already existing, that already have under international human rights, could be of help. Here we have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that could be quite helpful, where we have a duty of states to protect individuals against harms caused by business and their behavior, but also a corporate responsibility to protect and to respect, human rights, and with due diligence processes that can be put in place to support it. And so here, I think we need to be careful and think about all of these interactions and the need for whether there is a need for a new convention in this regard, or whether we could be operating with the existing frameworks and go more and deeper into these questions of transparency and accountability. But we could have already existing law and existing norms for that, and existing processes. So I think that would be quite interesting to verify.
Thank you, Anna, and all incredibly important points. And then just to expand the aperture, even more, and to build Eve on some of your comments earlier, I'd like to push a little bit further on some of the humanitarian implications. So, as the former Director General of ICRC, what would a digital Geneva Convention potentially mean for humanitarian action, and how would it relate to existing civilian protections? And just more broadly, how do you think about, and how would you define matters of humanitarian protection in the digital age? Eve, you need to unmute.
Life is always complex. I was just saying, I'm a little bit struck with Anna's comment, and she's right. I think one of the issues since 2017, when Brad Smith launched the idea of the convention, it's true, he let's say expanded. He said this in peacetime. Of course, the Geneva Conventions are related first and foremost to with conflict area. And I think there is always this difficulty somewhat to be able to navigate between the two. But let's say if we talk about if we would have something like that, and I'm not sure we need to have a Geneva Convention, as I mentioned, but let's imagine that we would agree, and state we would agree that we have a global framework and somewhat we are moving in that directions, it would change a lot of things. I think the first thing in terms of humanitarian organization, it change at least two things. The first one is it will really change. It is already the case, but it will be a confirmation that the needs, what we call humanitarian needs, are shifting, are changing. You will still have to deal a lot with classical humanitarian needs related to health, to water, to physical protection for people, migration, to disappearing. But you would have also to deal suddenly with issues related to infrastructure, including private infrastructure, Wi-Fi, data, and then you would really have to deal with, in fact, what start to constitute a critical element for anybody, especially somebody at risk, then their own personal data. We've seen over the last, let's say, 5 years, really a booming in terms of protection, data protections, regulation, and reflections around that. But then the humanitarian sectors will have to really completely, I would say, do a paradigm shift around that, much more than it is already today. And that will be central, which means you realize that, in fact, the classical, if I would say, needs is shifting, and then it will then oblige a humanitarian organization to really shift their services. That's clear for me. So you would have humanitarian organization, and it's already the case for organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, and others that are reflecting about that. But it means that organization, I would say, if we would have this push, kind of a sort of Geneva Convention, then I would say in the years to come, you would have to have international organization that would then start to move into, I would say, a humanitarian Google, as powerful as that, and challenging, in fact, the technology, because they would have to create the space, including the diplomatic space, maybe the technology space, in order to be able to protect the data of the people. And that will be central. If the humanitarian organization would not be able to do, they will lose first their relevance. I mean, if we agree that, personal data are the core of major issues when it comes to people affected and community affected, if they're not able to respond, they will lose their relevance. And you start to see that already, but it will be much more massive. And B, of course, they will also start their ability to influence, in fact, the entire ecosystem. That will be absolutely central. Now, a kind of digital Geneva Convention might also help them to get, in fact, credit, but also possibly the authorization by state nations. And I would say, if we think large, by technology also, that there is a space in the cyberspace that could be neutral and impartial. If you think about that, that is so interesting. How would we have to construct that? But somewhat state nation, technology also, would have to agree that, yes, there is a place where there is no backdoor. Yes, there is a place that is really, truly impartial and neutral. Wow. And safe for people. Imagine what it means in terms of technology, in terms of blockchain, in terms of cyber technology, but also in terms of agreement and commitment. And so far, I don't see that happen, right? Because what I see is technology that are used and constantly used to pump data and to use them, including for security services. But that will be central for me. That will be a major change. And if the humanitarian organizations are not able to fight and find a space for that, as in fact humanitarian organization did that in the 19th and 20th century, then that would be very dramatic, if you want to say. So that would be for me, the biggest change. And maybe the other change that will happen is, in fact, a different set of stakeholders in conflict. And here I'm back to conflict, but it's already the case. It's already today, you can influence dramatically a situation when it comes to cyber, but and to the situation of a country, of infrastructure and all that. It will just be developing more. And I think here that means that you, as a humanitarian organization, you would have to tackle not just non-state armed group as we do, but also technology, private people. So I think you would have a mushrooming of stakeholders. And that is maybe the only appeal for me of a global framework, is to have a common grammar, because it's not just about state and not just about technology. It's also about people. And we see that. We see the power of people today in their ability to also really have a huge influence. And I would say also, I'm talking about the people, I'm talking about people that are affected, but also people that are willing to maybe play or be predators. So I think there is a mix between all that will deeply change that. My last comment, though, is related to the right focus. And I'm like Anna, I think, and Stefan too, I think it's great to think about, it's very appealing for all the reasons we know, because the Geneva Convention have changed the way the world relates to war, the way it relates to violence, the way people understand that they are in the most horrible situation. So I think that is very powerful. But the critical element remains implementation, really. And I'm of the opinion that there are enough norms. They're not perfect. Maybe we're looking at a bit of global language and common language. Still, the norms are there. What will make the difference will be, in fact, implementation. Will be exactly what Anna and Stefan says. Will be really having the ability to really check what's happening. Will be the accountability. We know it. It's not new. It's already the case in the field, but that will be totally central. And this is true, by the way, in times of crisis, war, and in times of peace. This is where the consensus needs to happen, right? My only worry, of course, is human being in general, especially when we are collective, and when it comes to then our different identity and our different groups and our different nations, we have a tendency to wait really massive problems before waking up. And that's my concern. I hope we will be able to do that before we have a massive problems when it comes to cyber and cyberspace.
Thank you so much, Yves. A number of really important points there, including on the mushrooming of stakeholders and what that would mean for coordination and cooperation and really for implementation, and maybe building a little bit on that and some of the comments from our other panelists. I want to ask a question to all of you before we turn. We have some great questions coming in from our audience. So just one more from me. Is a little bit picking up on this number of stakeholders and the number, the policy landscape that we see emerging. We know that there are big gaps and disagreements in the tech policy space. We see countries, regional organizations, international organizations proposing and developing, different policies, different rules. And this is a global challenge. Does a digital Geneva Convention have the capacity to unite some of these interests across a variety of actors and maybe serve as an umbrella to bring together what we're seeing as a sort of a proliferation of processes? So I want to give everyone an opportunity to respond to that question, and then anything else you heard from your fellow panelists. Maybe we'll start with Stefan.
Thank you for this. Coming to your question, but reacting to what Yves was just mentioning and building from Anna's points on the state of play of what we have, that in fact should be enough if it would be implemented properly in order to provide sufficient protection. So, and I like Yves' comment in the sense that yes, it's more than time for implementation. And the Cyber Peace Institute, we don't pretend that we can change everything, but at the minimum, we have this ambition to be this neutral and impartial entity that is taking that call to measure, document, and act as a watchdog for this implementation. Because it's about accountability not only of states, but to my fellow panelists' point, but also of the industry. You may hear left and right that the world is bracing itself for cyber Pearl Harbor, like an Armageddon, that what is going to happen next in the cyberspace, but it happened already. It was more insidious. It's a collection, a silence collection, and build-up of attacks and crises, one after the other. Everyone is calling this wake-up calls, but it's more than time to stay awake. And we are in a situation today where some part of the industry can just manufacture and sell spyware to attack activists and human rights defenders and journalists, leading in some cases to threat to life, if not death. That's the reality. We have attacks, as I was mentioning before, on what is vital today to society, the right to health, with attack to healthcare. And still, it looks like we are waiting for something more. So no, we are not. We are there. There's rules. They may be imperfect, but they are there. So before look, what was very interesting into this call for the convention is that it gave this ambition for something more. And via this ambition, I think it's more than time to look into all this agreement, all these rules on this month, and to really document if they're implemented or not. And for this, at least at the Institute, we will provide this platform, neutral, independent, where the public, the citizen, the people will access information about what these states are doing and what is the status of the attack. Because we think it's the first step of the public knowledge that we need to have to drive change. And to Yves' point, it's the responsibility of civil society and humanitarian actors, for sure.
Great, thank you so much. And Anna, any reflections on the question that I posed around sort of uniting different efforts, and then responding to some of the comments raised by your panelists? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm not convinced that we are at a time where a new treaty would suddenly create this perfect implementation, because that new treaty will also need to be implemented, and we might have also problems with the implementation of that new digital Geneva Convention. So I think there is a risk that is not small on calling for new treaties to be negotiated and adopted, and the risk is that we might lessen the protection of those treaties that are already in place. And so I think I agree with both Stefan and Yves that there is a problem with implementation, and there is a problem with accountability. But I don't see too much how creating a new instrument of international law would then solve this problem. So perhaps what is interesting is to have these conversations and continue this dialogue, and perhaps that's what we need now, is to see how this situation can evolve, and how the responses from states, but also from the technology industry and from the civil society could be a coherent one, in which you would find a space for dialogue and for better implementation of the existing rules and norms of international law. So I think I would say that should be a priority.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anna. Some really concrete thoughts on if now is not the time for a treaty, and knowing what we know about how long it does take to negotiate treaties. It can be 10, 15 years longer. What are some practical steps that we can be taking today to address this implementation gap? Yves, I want to offer you the floor to react to the question or any of the other points that your panelists have raised.
I think we know that we're living in a time where if you want to influence, you have to be specific. It's very sad, but that's the case. You have almost to be anecdotal, right? You have to be very specific of what you want to do. And that's the only way where you would maybe generate enough pressure at the level of state, but also at the level of industry and at the level of people. It's extremely difficult today to go in a kind of a large initiative, go in the Geneva Conventions for digital, which the expert already will discuss it and not sure what it is, how it works, and then it will go into the diplomatic. Nobody will understand, and we will lose very quickly, in fact, the leverage that is needed in order to achieve a result. And I think Anna mentioned that then we guarantee if there will be a treaty, then the treaty in terms of protection will be lower than the existing norm. There is no question about that, right? If you look at what will happen, what is happening already in the cyberspace in general, right? The lack of governance that we have. So I think we would need to be specific, and I really would like to take on what Stefan mentioned. We could be specific, and some organizations are doing it, but we could absolutely organize, for example, in a much more aggressive, it was indirect way around the health issue. Health has become, over the last, let's say, 5 years, the new battlefield in war. I mean, look at what has happened over the last, maybe 10 years, but now with an acceleration where health facilities are targeted, on purpose, strategically. I'm thinking about Syria, about Afghanistan, but we can go on and on, right? And we know it. And we've tried at the time at the ICRC to reach out, and other organizations have done that, MSF and other, but it's still central. What I found so interesting, what Stefan's saying, is it's also the case right now in peacetime, where health seems to be the new battlefield, new place where you go and when you attack. This is a place where we could mobilize in a much more direct way, where people, because that's important at the end, will feel, oh my God, this is my data. It's not about war, it's not about Yemen or Somalia. No, it's about me here with my own data and what it means. And yes, I somewhat want something that guarantee me that the way my data are treated are protected. And we know it's a big issue in our society, and we need to have conversation. But that might be one of the way where you create the leverage. And I think health is not the only one, but it's typically one issue. And I've seen organizations starting to do global appeal or bringing, in fact, eminent personality around health and specifically attack against hospital, trying to avoid that. But I think things could be better. So I would say I would encourage Microsoft, for example, and Brad Smith and others to say, okay, was great, maybe a bit too large. Now let's mobilize ourselves around one specific issues where they can also be held accountable.
That's great. Another really concrete set of ideas of how to move forward and how to address this implementation gap. I want to turn, we have some great questions rolling in from our audience, and one of them is about some interest in a little bit more on the current nature of threats. And I invite any of you to jump in on this, but do we have any idea of who is behind most attacks? Are they states or are they non-state actors? We know that in the initial conception that Brad Smith and Microsoft put forward, this was really intended to be a proposal about state attacks in peacetime. Is that the where we're seeing the majority of attacks? And I'll open it up for anyone to jump in.
I can start. I can open if it's okay with everyone. There's no baseline when it comes to the number of attacks that are happening in a cyberspace. For one obvious reason is that they are vastly underreported, and for a lot of historical reason and also liability reason. For some victims, it's about being re-victimized just to go in the open and explaining that you've been attacked. So that's the basis. The second, so just because of that, it's very difficult to know, who is attacking the most if you make this difference in between criminal and states. But let's try to look at this from a different angle. You could argue that at the end of the day, states are responsible for everything because they are states. So they even themselves, states, are stating it in the recent GG report by saying that it's about this coalition and this common approach to responsibility in cyberspace to reduce this operating space to criminal groups and terrorists. So state responsibility is to reduce this operating space. So let's be very practical to his point. When you have an attack like the one that happened in Finland last year, where criminals are stealing data from patients, and patients' data, which means their intimate discussion with their psychologists, all their secrets, all their fear, everything was there, stolen, and then bargained patient by patient, victim by victim, with a threat, you pay or it's out on the internet. So you have this on one hand, and on the other hand, you have very recent declaration from head of state saying that maybe if a state is agreeing to exchange criminals with us, we will think about prosecuting and going against criminal. I mean, for victims, they should not be looking at criminals as a bargaining chip, and that's state responsibility to be sure that not only it's not about not attacking. 1 year ago, with the ICRC, we could host and coordinate a call to all governments, not only not to attack healthcare, but most importantly to protect. And protect is about this, making sure that in your own country, there's law enforcement, prosecution, with public oversight, transparent proceedings in order to go against criminal. And that's state's responsibility. And as a state, not to say that cyber espionage is, you can just do it. Because when you do cyber espionage, the tools that you use and the vulnerabilities that you create on the cyberspace are, at the end of the day, used again by criminals and impacting everyone. So you can really think that globally, the responsibility goes vastly to states.
Thanks, Stefan. Yves or Anna, did you want to jump in on this question?
Well, I would like just to say that perhaps one thing that we need to do here is to distinguish between two different scenarios. You have the situation in which you have cyber criminals operating within the the territory or the jurisdiction of a state, and this would be a matter for domestic law. And as Stefan is pointing out, rightly so, then states would have a responsibility for that. And as a state has a responsibility to prosecute someone that would commit any other crime within its jurisdiction. So here it's a matter of domestic law, and that states are sovereign, and they would regulate their domestic laws as they would see fit. Now there is another question, which is when you have operations that would be interstate, and so there we have difficulties also attributing these cyber attacks or cyber operations to different states, and another set of rules that would apply under international law. But I think we need to make this distinction because these are very different scenarios and situations in which different sets of rules and norms apply.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important distinction, Anna. Thank you for raising it. Yves, did you want to jump in on this question?
No, just to confirm what we've seen already in the press. I think it's interesting to see. I think it was New York Times, and you mentioned that, Megan, in op-ed, I think yesterday, talking about Biden and Putin and starting to say, okay, now these days, you suddenly have cyber and cyber attack and cyber war and cyber security being suddenly elevated somewhat at the level of the nuclear threat that we've been over decades. So I think there is something important about that. I think we should, as always, not spend too much time about is it state or not. I think I totally agree with what Stefan says. I think in general, states have the responsibility to create the environment and to protect their citizens. That is really their work. And I think we also start to know that since now quite some years, states have used criminal also to do their work. So I think here we really are at the core of the issues. Let's start to be clear. State have I don't want now to say the calculation, but have a massive responsibility when it comes to this issue.
Thanks so much, Yves. You teed up the next question that I wanted to ask perfectly. We have a question that came in asking, what can NGOs do to advance knowledge of cyber attacks as a threat to international humanitarian law? I want to also add other sectors and other stakeholders. You know, this proposal came from the private sector. Is there more that the private sector can be doing? Is there more that the technical community can be doing, that research communities can be doing? I'd be interested in building on some of the practical ideas and next steps that you all have identified already in our conversation. And welcome anyone to jump in.
I could maybe just start because I'm among the panelists. I'm the less expert in terms of some of the questions related to cyber. I think really what NGO, but not just NGO, I would say you mentioned private sectors and other could do is to really reinforce the understanding and the awareness about what are we talking when it comes to personal data. I'm really a strong believer, and I must say I was sometimes stunned by the lack of debate when it comes to data. So it's all very, very technical, or people are very confused or not always very rational when it comes. Look at what happens around the COVID. And we know that COVID-19 and some of the decision taking by, in fact, state, but also private sector is shifting. It will be like 9/11. We will not come back in some of the discussions and some of the decision taken. So this is a moment where you start to have conversation. And I know it's complicated conversation, but we need to have a conversation because it is shifting our social contract, the way we relate to each other. And maybe most importantly, it's also shifting the way we trust each other. We're living already a world, I would say, where trust is not anymore the default mode in which we operate. This is not new, but I think we are living in a world where we are more on the prove me, right? So tell me, prove me that you are neutral, or prove me that you are safe, or you didn't have COVID. And I think the tendency will to use technology more and more in order to do that. And I think we see that with our mobile phone, all that. So I think it's a critical moment for me. So beyond now the Geneva digital questions, I think there are really moments where we need to be able to have this conversation, and they will be difficult. And this is our job. I would say some NGOs, but also I would say, we didn't talk about that, but the academic sector, that's the moment for the academic sectors also to move outside sometimes of their reflections. The reflections are remarkable, but it's time to push them in the society to have really conversation. I would argue the big tech and the private sectors have a role to play. Some of them maybe don't want to do that because it's too challenging, and maybe it's also challenging for their business, but it's time to have this conversation about what does that mean for our social contract, for us, how do we live together, what are the, I would say, the rules that are governing us. And I'm not talking now about the Geneva Convention, I'm really talking about the way we are living together. That is really the central questions that seems for me very important.
Thank you, Yves. And Anna, maybe I'll come to you to just see if you wanted to jump in on this.
Wow, I think Yves had a very good point about how academics and civil society should join the discussions, and I think that that's exactly what we're happening to be doing now, and that's fantastic that we have this panel here and the opportunity to discuss together about points that are so important for society. So yeah, I agree. I think we need to have more of these multi-stakeholder opportunities for engaging in dialogue, having NGOs, having civil society, having academics joining in, and also the technology industry and representatives from states. And here, I think that the technology industry would be key as well to progress, as they hold the keys for how to make the technology work. So I think it would be interesting to have them on board as well, and reminding them that they have this corporate responsibility vis-a-vis the protection and the respect of human rights. And I think that that's quite important in this field.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anna. And over to Stefan.
Yeah, I'll be brief, conscious of the time. To the question, what NGO can do, very practical example. When we committed our time and resources with our partners in this report, analytical report that you can find on our website about what is happening to healthcare, why attacking healthcare is in fact playing with lives, we discovered that there was a lot of energy in academia, in civil society, in the private sector to really map this problematic. But it was not being put together into something that can be useful for the victims, because we look into what is happening to healthcare professionals and patients, but also to states, because if they're responsible, they also need to have the right information in order to take decision. So to make a product that could be useful for state in order to take decision. So that's something very practical that you can do, because by doing this, we could really show that at the end of the day, the patient or the healthcare professional is facing a lot of different attacks from a lot of different actors, and this is happening in this norm and law ecosystem. And then you make the link in between how well are these laws being domestic, international, working for the victims against these attacks. Something very, very practical that you can find.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And we're almost at the hour, and I know there's an incredible next panel that will start right at 1 p.m. So unfortunately, we have to close out our conversation, and I won't try to sum up such a nuanced conversation in 30 seconds. I have dozens more questions that I'd love to ask our panelists. But I really appreciate some of these concrete ideas around how we can be fostering multi-stakeholder conversations. What are some of the practical ways and actions that different sectors can act on this challenge now, even if a treaty might seem a little bit out of reach in this moment. I want to thank our panelists who offered such thoughtful and rich remarks and gave us a lot to consider. And I want to thank all of you who tuned in and gave us such great questions, and really appreciate your time and hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Megan, for doing an amazing job moderating that fascinating discussion about a digital Geneva Convention. I'm going to rewatch it later today just to get my head around it. It's complex, but it's so fascinating. And I want to thank Stefan, Yves, and Anna. Thanks for joining us from Geneva. I know it was kind of early evening for you, but thank you. We really appreciate you taking your time. So I would now like to ask our previous panelists to leave the studio by pressing the Leave Studio button. And we're going to ask all of the other speakers to join. I see them popping up. And this session is equally interesting, and it ties into the last session we just had, but it's on digital attacks on human rights and democracy activists. An interesting thing here, there's a Facebook report that came out a little while ago that's showing that Uyghur activists in Canada were being targeted through inauthentic campaigns. So this is something that is touching many countries. It's not a theoretical discussion. It's an actual real discussion that is important and we need to wrap our heads around as well. So I'd like to take the time now to introduce our moderator, Melody Patry, who's an advocacy director at Accessnow. Melody, thank you for joining us. I know you're probably just catching your breath after a RightsCon last week, which was amazing event. But I would like to ask Melody to take the floor and introduce our speakers and take the conversation from there.
Of course, thank you very much. And yes, exactly. I am just out of RightsCon where this very topic was discussed in many sessions, sometimes even like divided into different sessions, because unfortunately the digital threats, the digital attacks against civil society have increased. We are now talking about an erosion of the civic space, but also an erosion of democracy. And that's why I am really excited to have this conversation today and to have three excellent panelists who all have different expertise to discuss the topic today. So I'll briefly share a few points when it comes to what to expect from this conversation, noting that when we talk about digital attacks, for a very long time, we were talking about a bit like unreal attacks. Some people were even calling making a difference between the online world and the offline world, calling it the real world, which in that case would mean that digital attacks are unreal. And I can testify, and I've spoken with many others who could also testify that digital attacks are very much real. They have life consequences, whether it's, like a malware infecting one of your devices, allowing for, like state actors to have access to your conversation, have access to your location and more sensitive information that have very real consequences in the offline world, but also online harassment. There's been like enough studies now and even testimonies from people sharing their experience so that we can no longer just completely conflate the offline and the offline or the digital, the offline, and the online or digital. And that's why discussing those threats and their impact is so prevalent. So for this discussion today, I am pleased to welcome three speakers, Bethany, Isabel, and Steve. I am sure that they will have a lot to say and a lot to contribute. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to pop them into the chat. I'll make sure to discuss them and to address them. But I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers before letting them tell us more about their work. But we'll first hear from Steve Fieldstein, who is the author of a new book, The Rise of Digital Repression, How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. So quite on topic and quite on brand for the session today. Steve is also a senior fellow at Carnegie, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. We will then hear from Bethany. Sorry, I'm lost into my different notes. Bethany Allen, who is the China reporter at Axios. And finally, we will hear from Isabel Linzer, who just wrote a report for Freedom House, where she leads on technology. When she leads, on technology and democracy, and specifically on election watch for the digital age. So welcome all, and without further ado, I'll let the floor to Steve for him to tell us a bit more about his work and maybe about his recent book in the context of today's session.
Great. Well, thank you, Melody, for the nice introduction and for framing the discussion for this session. I'm really looking forward to the conversation between us and also hearing from your questions. And so as Melody mentioned, I recently published a book on the rise of digital repression. And so I'll spend the next few minutes talking about some of the findings in that book and how they relate to, I mean, actually they directly encompass, I think, the themes of what we're talking about today. And so when I approached this project about 3 years ago, my goal was really to both understand better what the nature of different patterns of digital repression look like. So to really hone in on sort of parsing out what we're talking about when we mention digital repression, and then to understand some of the key aspects in terms of the relationship between traditional repression and digital techniques, what factors are most relevant in determining whether leaders will deploy digital tools to advance their objectives, what role are external actors, particularly China and Russia, playing when it comes to proliferating the deployment of these tools, and whether it's even possible to quantify the prevalence of who is using what. And so these questions not only led me to kind of look broadly at a lot of data when it came to understanding what digital repression exactly is and how it's distributed, but I also ended up undertaking 3 case studies, each of which forms a chapter in the book, where I went to Thailand, the Philippines, and Ethiopia to interview people on the ground and talk about their experiences and what kind of motivation and incentives are guiding the deployment and use of advanced technologies for repressive purposes. So let me sort of mention some of the key findings that came from the book, which I think are directly relevant when it comes to understanding the nature of what digital repression looks like and its relationship to kind of the broader array of coercive techniques available to a state. First of all, I think, as Melody mentioned, the idea that there is a separation between digital techniques and traditional techniques is really a fiction at this point. For one, a lot of digital techniques themselves, whether we're looking at mass surveillance systems, arrests or targeted persecution of online users, or internet shutdowns, lead precisely to physical world consequences. So when you assemble, let's say, as a demonstrator in a public square, and you are then subsequently picked up via facial recognition surveillance because of your attendance in that demonstration, that's a real world consequence. That's not a virtual world consequence. That's not something where it's a matter of whether you log into a platform or not. And so I think there's been very much a morphing of those two. What I found in my research is that, in fact, one of the most salient predictors of whether a country will use digital tools, censorship, surveillance, internet shutdowns, disinformation campaigns against its citizens is the extent to which that country itself is authoritarian. In other words, there's a very, very close relationship to the level of authoritarianism in a given country and its and the likelihood that the country has a high prevalence of digital repression. And I think that's important. What's also interesting, though, is that while all authoritarian countries digitally repress to a large extent, they do so in different ways. So the type of techniques that one would find used in an authoritarian country like China, mass surveillance, reliance on big data collection techniques, censorship via the Great Firewall, is very different than the type of techniques that other countries with a less sophisticated digital infrastructure, say Uganda, or the Philippines, or Pakistan might resort to. And so there are lots of different techniques that are used, but they vary depending on the type of regime in place. Second of all, while authoritarian countries, while there's much more prevalence of digital technology, digital repression in authoritarian countries, democracies, particularly weak democracies, are also high. You also see high prevalence of digital repression as well. So some of the countries that I'm most concerned about, where you're seeing kind of leading levels, new trends of digital repression, include India, where you're seeing the imposition of mass surveillance systems, not to mention greater scrutiny and constraints on social media. Brazil, large amounts of disinformation. Turkey, and a number of other sort of hybrid mixed regimes or weak democracies. So it's not an authoritarian problem. It is a global problem. in terms of this issue. Now, one last point I want to talk about is there's a lot of questions about what role China is playing in proliferating digital authoritarianism worldwide. And this is a tricky issue. I think there's, without question, China is showing a lot of parallel modeling. It is showcasing what is possible to many would-be autocrats or dictators around the world when it comes to the ability of technology to repress political freedoms. And I think that has an important and a symbolic effect that many other countries are emulating. But when it comes down to China specifically going into countries, particularly countries that otherwise wouldn't resort to those tools, and actively peddling these technologies as a new component for repression, I found much less evidence of that taking place, certainly not in the case studies in my book. And I think there's a couple aspects of that that are worth thinking about. For one, in many of the countries that one would assume China is playing a big role providing a nascent technology to, let's say Ethiopia or the Philippines, what I actually found was that companies based in democracies, the United States, European countries, and Israel, were just as active in supplying these technologies as Chinese firms were. So that's an important role, important aspect. Number two is that so many of these leaders in place have existing repressive goals that they are already pursuing. So what technology gives is a new way to accelerate, to deepen their ability to penetrate into the communications of opposition activists, to surveil and monitor individuals who may present threats to the regime. But it's not as if repression wasn't already an existing factor in these countries anyway. And so to that end, I think it's important really to tie in the pre-existing level of constraints on political freedom to the digital repression side that increasingly is a fact of life in so many authoritarian states around the world. Why don't I stop there? And I look forward to hearing from my panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you for mentioning the relation and actually the correlation between the level of authoritarianism and the propensity to use digital tools to repress citizens. And I wanted to quickly pick up to make a nice transition to one of the countries that you mentioned, which is China and its role into what is perceived as digital repression, but especially as exporting digital repression tools and policies. And our next speaker specializes on the country. And so, Isabel, can you tell us a bit more? Have you come to similar conclusion? Have you observed similar facts when it comes to the role and the place of China into these digital threats and attacks? Or is this something that maybe is more of a projection of Western fears, as we say? I'm really looking forward to hear from your perspective. Bethany, sorry.
Okay, thanks so much for that introduction, and great to join this panel, and thanks to the previous speaker. I thought your book was really important, and I also love the point about how US companies and other companies that are from democracies are also exporting or providing the tools and softwares for this kind of surveillance as well. I am going to focus on China and some recent examples that we've seen. What I want to talk about is the growing extraterritorial authoritarian governance that the Chinese government is exercising over the digital space, and especially how US tech companies are increasingly complicit in exchange for profit and access to the Chinese market. Chinese law requires, and these are some new Chinese laws passed in the past, within the last 5 to 6 years. Chinese law requires electronic service communications providers operating within China's borders to monitor live communications, to block content deemed politically sensitive or illegal, to suspend accounts transmitting such content, and to hand over any related data and personal information upon request by a Chinese law enforcement or national security agency. The new cybersecurity law that took effect in June 2017 requires companies to store data for Chinese users on servers in China, strengthening Chinese state control over this information. And the new national security law, which was, I believe, implemented in 2015, requires any entity or company or individual who is asked to assist China's law enforcement or security agencies to, if they're asked for assistance in any kind of national security investigation, they are required to provide that assistance, and they're also required to keep that assistance a secret. Now, this is part of what people call China's rule by law, wherein they are codifying their authoritarian practices into law, as opposed to just doing them and pretending that they're not doing them. And this makes it more difficult for US companies to avoid complying with these laws. And it also gives them an out. You know, when they are questioned by US media outlets, for example, oh, we discovered that you're doing this thing in China, why are you doing it? Then, you know, companies can say, oh, we're just, you know, abiding by local law as we do in every market. And that is an excuse that we see over and over and over again from Zoom, from Apple, from lots of companies. And the result of this is that tech companies with operations in China are increasingly facing one of two paths. And that path is either to choose between the China market and the US market, because what they're being asked to do in China goes so deeply against democratic values, or they will have to create a firewall wherein they rope off their China operations from the rest of the world. Companies that faced the axe in China the earliest, such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google, so these were companies that were blocked or left China right around 2009, 2010. They took the first path where they just left China, choosing to stay out of China rather than reworking their operations to comply with the government's censorship demands. But the simple choice to leave China's market feels like a bygone era, because there's so much money to be made there. It's such a huge and growing market. And as China's own domestic tech sector, you know, is now starting to lead the world in advanced technologies like AI, for example, it feels, you know, companies in Silicon Valley feel like they cannot, you know, cut themselves off from that market. So it feels mandatory. And that is the dynamic there that is giving the Chinese government and its laws extraterritorial governance, or starting to give it an extraterritorial type governance over digital spaces outside of China as well. And I'll get into some of the specifics. And companies that were later to the game, like LinkedIn and Zoom, kind of automatically just acceded to Beijing's demands. In 2014, LinkedIn said it would, you know, censor its China platform, so remove content from that platform that you can see outside of China. And also, we see companies starting to have a much deeper integration with Chinese government security and surveillance institutions. So I'm going to talk about, I think, three, if I have time, examples here: Zoom, Apple, and Google. So last year, when everyone started using Zoom, Zoom rather notoriously shut down the accounts of several US-based Chinese pro-democracy activists. Now, this is an American company shutting down the accounts of Americans in America talking about the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. Zoom admitted they had done so at the Chinese government's request. But what happened next was really interesting, and that is that the Department of Justice opened an investigation into Zoom. And this they ended up being a groundbreaking investigation, and they released an indictment late last year that revealed a lot of details behind the scenes of how a Chinese employee of Zoom in China had served as basically an agent of the Ministry of State Security and had used his access to Zoom as an employee to surveil accounts outside of China, to get those accounts shut down. He also requested that Zoom actually transfer accounts of 20,000 people outside of China that China deemed to be China accounts, so Chinese people outside of China. He got these accounts transferred to to their servers in China, just handed that information right over, and used his platform there to shut down these accounts. But what's interesting about the DOJ investigation is that it was the first time that the Department of Justice has actually done an investigation into a U.S. company for its acceding to Chinese government demands. So that was a positive development, and that indictment also clearly it labeled the Chinese government as an authoritarian government that is using these kinds of mechanisms in order to harass Chinese pro-democracy dissidents abroad. It was a pretty clear line in the sand of DOJ saying that they're not going to permit this anymore, that they're going to go after it. That's a big difference because Chinese dissidents in the US have been reporting this kind of harassment for years to the Department of Justice, and they never did anything. So that's a positive development. I may be running out of time. So just briefly, Apple also has followed the path of becoming more deeply integrated into Chinese government institutions. And a recent example is that they opened will be opening a data center in a Chinese province. That data center is operated by a Chinese state-owned company. So Chinese government employees are going to be the ones who are actually operating that data center, and the encryption keys are stored in that facility. If Apple wants to prevent the Chinese government from accessing Chinese user data, it may not even be able to. And very briefly, Google, the example of Google, in 2017, they started exploring or creating a bespoke pre-censored search engine for China called codenamed Project Dragonfly. That project was leaked to The Intercept in 2018, but it took almost an entire year of intense media coverage, of further leaks about the project. Google employees, 1,400 Google employees signed an open letter saying that they wanted that project to be canceled. Vice President Mike Pence called out Google by name in a speech and called for the project to be canceled. The CEO of Google went in front of a congressional committee to defend the project. It took a year of that much pressure for Google to finally suspend the project. Why? We can only presume it's because of money and access to the platform. So, what we're seeing here is the real, almost unavoidable pull of the money that is available in the Chinese market.
Thank you very much, Bethany, and my apologies again for confusing the name earlier. I think, the role, as you said, not just of China, but the role of US companies or foreign companies, very often based in the US, the role in implementing China's requests, I think, speaks for itself with the three examples that you just mentioned. And I have to say, for the Google example, for example, with Project Dragonfly, it was intense coverage, which shows just how important the work of reporters and information coming out is crucial in addressing these issues. And when we talk about information coming out, obviously one of the other topics and one of the other threats that is on the rise in this discussion is internet shutdowns. And so at Accessnow, we've done a lot of work on internet shutdowns and looking especially at their role during elections, and the fact that in the past 3 years, countries have started to increasingly order intentional internet shutdowns just before, during, or after an election. And so we have denounced this practice as a threat to democracy, in addition to a violation of human rights. But Isabel, let me turn to you now, because I know that you've done quite a lot of work on elections and, like democracy and elections. And so have you seen, in addition to internet shutdowns, and maybe you can discuss, you can tell us a bit more about this, but what other threats and what other attacks have we been able to see, and what in your work is relevant for this conversation?
Thanks, Melody, and thanks to the other panelists as well. We've touched on some themes that I'm really looking forward to talking about. And also thanks, Right City, this is a great opportunity to talk about such an obviously important topic, and it's one that we are working on constantly at Freedom House in kind of across the organization. Our programs teams support activists documenting and raising awareness about human rights abuses. Our emergency assistance program has supported over 4,000 individuals and organizations in over 110 countries who are threatened due to their human rights work. And attacks, digital attacks, especially on human rights defenders, are also a major theme in Freedom House's research, and that's mostly what I want to talk about today. In particular, Freedom on the Net, our annual survey of internet freedom in 65 countries, looks at how the rights of internet users are protected or violated online, as well as the offline repercussions that they face for online activities. We also track those risks specifically ahead of elections, as Melody mentioned. And the use of digital technology to target activists was also a major theme in our special report on transnational repression that I co-authored and we'll talk about a bit later. So what types of digital attacks are we seeing? We are seeing targeted attacks by state and non-state actors against people for their digital activism, as well as their political, social, or religious expression online. In 32 of the 65 countries we cover through Freedom on the Net, a person was physically attacked or killed in retribution for political, social, or religious expression. In January, for example, a group of men attacked a Turkish journalist attempting to run him over with a car. And that attack came 2 days after he published an online column that was critical of the Nationalist Movement Party. The attackers apparently told the journalists that they worked for the Nationalist Movement Party and that he should stop criticizing the party. This connection here becomes very clear. In 38 of the 65 countries that we look at in Freedom on the Net, there were technical attacks against government critics or human rights organizations. Thinking back to earlier this year, a Cuban independent journalist and government critic lost access to her Facebook account very shortly after some critical reporting, and it was apparently hacked into in retribution for her work. That's quite a common problem that Cuban critics face, but also others around the world. Surveillance and harassment online are two other key methods by which people are targeted, and they're also two very important components of transnational repression, as documented by our report Out of Sight, Not Out of Reach, which came out in February. So of the 31 governments that engage in physical transnational repression, meaning they have attacked, kidnapped, assassinated, unlawfully deported, or detained one of their nationals abroad, at least 17 of them also use spyware against exiles in diaspora. And that's notwithstanding the dozens of countries that use spyware domestically. China is one of these countries, and Bethany has spoken some about this already, and they've used powerful spyware abroad against Uyghurs, against Tibetans, and others. But this list of governments using spyware to target activists in countries elsewhere does not only include global powers, which I think is something that can get lost in some of the focused coverage. Smaller countries like Rwanda use spyware too. For example, in the famous NSO WhatsApp hack a couple of years ago, it came out that at least 6 Rwandans were among those targeted in the hack. On harassment, at least 22 of the governments engaging in physical transnational repression also use online threats and harassment as part of that strategy of transnational repression overall. So stepping back a bit, though, I want to kind of give 3 key takeaways from Freedom House's research on digital attacks against individuals more broadly. First is that as activists rely on digital technology more and more, it also creates more opportunities to target them. Using digital communication tools to organize with each other and social media to reach audiences creates a lot of points for entry, for harassment, for spyware. And this is actually a driving factor in why transnational repression is a growing global phenomenon. But also, as much as surveillance is important, there's also a huge open source component here. Information that's revealed on social media, where someone is, who they interact with professionally or personally, can make them and their loved ones vulnerable to online and offline attacks. That brings me to my second point. When we talk about digital attacks, we also have to talk about offline implications, as Melody set up very nicely at the start of this session. Famously, the UN Special Rapporteur's report on the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi described evidence that linked spyware to the killing. And getting back to my point about multiple points of entry, the specific spyware infection implicated in Khashoggi's assassination wasn't even installed on Khashoggi's devices. It was installed on the phone of an activist that he was working with, Omar Abdulaziz. In addition then to the role that surveillance can play in planning future physical attacks, online threats and harassments can also take a very serious human toll that has offline consequences. It can push people to stop engaging in activism altogether. And unfortunately, we also see cases where these kinds of campaigns of harassment push people to harm themselves. Third, all of this is happening amid a climate of global decline of democracy and increasing closures of civic space, both online and offline. Through our Freedom on the Net research, we found that a record number of countries are arresting individuals for nonviolent political, social, and religious expression online. There's increasing censorship from governments that restricts access to independent news sites, forums, and entire social media platforms, and internet shutdowns that deprive people of the ability not only to organize, but also to communicate with loved ones, get information on how to stay safe in a conflict or, for example, during a pandemic. And then kind of to put that even into more context, 2020 was the 15th consecutive year of global decline in political rights and civil liberties. So that all paints a very grim picture, but it's not the whole truth, right? We know, we've seen that the internet and digital technologies have vastly increased opportunities for civic engagement in democracies and also in more closed countries. I think it's really important to remind ourselves of that because unfortunately today we're talking about the problems that those technologies have introduced into people's lives. But those problems are only coming up because we have something that is really good and is worth fighting for and protecting as we go forward. So to close, I'll just share some quick recommendations on how we can push back on some of these trends. Civil society organizations can offer digital hygiene training for activists and at-risk groups. They can also expand emergency assistance to support at-risk activists. Tech companies can invest in and advocate for protecting encrypted communication platforms. And finally, democratic governments can do their part to restrict the export of surveillance tools. As my colleagues on this panel mentioned, many of these tools are coming from democratic governments, so there's a clear opportunity there. Democratic governments can also train relevant law enforcement and diplomatic staff to make sure that complaints of digital attacks are taken seriously, because as we know, what happens online doesn't stay online. These are really serious consequences for people. And finally, democratic governments can work to hold other governments accountable for human rights violations. So I will close there. Thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And yes, we've already had a few questions coming, so I'll address them, but please keep them coming and I'll make sure that we address them. I will first use my privilege as moderator of this session to ask a question of my own to the three of you, because so as Isabel, you said, you painted what you said like a grim picture, and we know that it's quite a change from the high hopes of digital technologies and what they meant in terms of empowering people, mobilizing people, which is still the case. And that's why the threats are also on the rise. That's why we're seeing an increase, not just in the number, but also in the duration of internet shutdowns, for example. It's because there are still these clear assets for civil society, for citizens, especially those who did not have access to specific platforms before. So it's been quite a shift between, you know, the opportunity and now the threats. And as you said, some of these threats are so severe that, you know, when they don't lead to physical harm, they can lead to just a retirement from activism altogether. So would you say currently, like the cost calculation in terms of opportunity versus threats, have we already overcome the positive and the asset of these digital technologies, or do you see is it still a fair battle that we are fighting right now? I don't know who wants to start answering. Maybe you, Steve.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. You know, look, I think it's a cat and mouse struggle, and you know, we're right now at a moment, you know, that I think Isabel characterized really well, which is that we're seeing multiple years of authoritarian resurgence, and so I don't think you can separate out the digital from that. As you see an increasing number of governments turn authoritarian or embrace authoritarian methods, I think you're naturally going to see pressure against one of the main instruments that activists have and citizens have in which to communicate and to potentially challenge, autocratic rule. And so by nature itself, even if these tools can bring about, significant liberalizing effects, because they are viewed as such threats by rulers, they're naturally attracting more scrutiny. I would also just mention one other thing I was thinking about, which is that, in 2010, when we started talking about liberation technology and the promise of social media to power mass-based movements against dictators, at that point, I feel like digital life was very different than what it looks like today in 2021. And that even basic ways that people relied on digital platforms and the internet 11 years ago have shifted dramatically. There's a much greater deepening and reliance on the digital in all walks of life. And so I think it's almost a natural outcome that as the digital has become so firmly enmeshed in everything that we do, from business transactions to communication to chatting with friends and family, governments will naturally look upon this as the next frontier in which to repress. And so, this really is an ongoing fight. I don't think it's one side, one way or the other. And I do hope that it's cyclical in the sense that as new innovations and adaptations take root, the means by which activists can push back against some of the worst methods, whether it's spyware, internet shutdowns, and so forth, I hope that those methods that activists have at their disposal will also innovate and improve as well. But I think a lot remains to be seen in terms of how that will evolve.
Thank you, Steve. I wonder if Bethany has a different perspective, especially when it comes to people in China, because we talk a lot about China exporting some of the threats or asking private companies to implement some decisions in terms of, like censorship or filtering and so on. So, Bethany, do you share this? Is it still like a cat and mouse situation, or is the situation slightly more deteriorated? Obviously, it all depends on the context, but I wonder if you have a slightly different perspective on this.
I think I would basically agree with what Steve said about it's still, it's forces pushing back against one another, and sometimes one seems ahead and sometimes the other seems ahead. And if you look at China, I would say that in some ways, maybe around 2010, 2011 is when the internet and access to social media and this kind of thing gave Chinese people in China an incredible means of self-expression and a means of connecting with each other and understanding what other people were thinking. This was the time when Weibo, which is like China's version of Twitter, was really like a virtual public square, and people could actually talk about politics. And it seemed really positive. It seemed, like people could come together in a way that they hadn't been able to 10 years before or 20 years before. But if we were noticing that outside of China, the Chinese government was also noticing that. And it's been Xi Jinping's major project over the past 10 years to shut that down without crushing the economic and social and political benefits, or governance benefits, I should say, of having an internet and of having social media. And China has been incredibly successful at that. But even in its most repressive areas, so like Xinjiang, which is almost an information black hole, and they have, completely shut down the internet there at times. It's probably the most censored part of China's internet. Even there, the fact that there are so many digital tools that exist in the world and even in China has allowed some people to exercise their ingenuity to do reporting from there. And a great example of that is a series that BuzzFeed did that just won the Pulitzer Prize this week, where among other parts of the project, they were able to discover the location and map out and do really close internal mapping of hundreds of mass detention camps, using not just satellite imagery from non-Chinese satellites, but also using Baidu and using the Chinese government's own censorship of Baidu Maps. So if you look at Baidu Maps, which is the Chinese version of Google Maps, and they have satellite imagery for a lot of the country, but they have blurred out. They'll blur out sensitive government military facilities, whatever. And so BuzzFeed, Mega Rajagopal, was able to use that own censorship against the Chinese government, because you could look, if you zoom in on Xinjiang and you go around from place to place, and then suddenly there's something great out there. You're like, what's that? So then you compare that to like non-censored satellite images, and you discover, oh, it's a sensitive facility. Oh, look, it's a mass detention facility. And so they were able to use the Chinese government's own digital censorship against it. So it's this constant game like that. And I would be really surprised if like the Chinese government like wins even domestically, where they have so much more control, because there's constant innovation. I think the only way they would be able to do that is if they were able to totally wall off the internet and have a total Chinese intranet that was not accessible from the outside. But I don't think they have any interest in doing that, at least right now.
Thank you, Bethany. And I'm just going to switch it up a little bit for you, Isabel, also because you already shared so much when you talked about the Freedom House report. And when what we're seeing, and I really like the example given by Bethany about when, as much as states can use digital tools to censor us, we can also reverse it and use that digital censorship against them. And so in the current situation, and based on your research, Isabel, what technologies are used the most to harass and target activists? This is a question from the audience. They were asking about spyware, facial recognition. I assume it differs from country to country, but are there a few like trends or patterns that came out of your research in terms of the specific technologies that are used against activists?
Thanks for that question. So, you're right. It does certainly vary. After all, there are hundreds of companies selling commercial spyware around the world, which makes it quite a busy field. There are certainly some trends. I mean, in trends, not just in what governments are using, but then also what that leads activists and others to use. I think we've seen a shift, for example, away from people using WhatsApp and more towards using Signal after NSO, and then after recent concerns around just privacy with WhatsApp being part of kind of the Facebook family. There are the big name surveillance tools, of course, like Pegasus, but those are only some of them. And I think what's maybe more complicated to deal with in some ways than identifying what those kind of big expensive tools are is this question of how to deal with the public piece of it. I mentioned kind of the issue of social media and of social media surveillance. And I think that's a really important part of this to talk about, because that's what governments are also increasingly purchasing technology to monitor behavior on social media. And it's just getting easier and easier to do that, especially with the growth of AI and a cheapening AI market, that, these are some like very readily available public tools. And so even some smaller governments, local police agencies have the capacity to buy social media monitoring technology. And that was technology that used to only be accessible to basically kind of the top intelligence agencies in the world. And so I think the democratization of that kind of technology is even maybe more extreme for us to talk about than really kind of bespoke spyware questions. And just to say a little bit about the impact, I already mentioned that it can make you vulnerable. It can make people you interact with vulnerable just based on what is available on social media. But there's kind of bigger implications of that as well, because it can kind of suggest patterns and learning that is invisible to what normal people would see when we look at social media. But these kinds of technologies can look at kind of words in your social media posts and put together meanings which may flag people as being supportive of certain movements or being pro-LGBTQ rights, and put them in different groups and categories. And so what really happens when we're talking about social media surveillance is it puts everybody in this activist category in a way, right? This is broad base, looking at entire populations instead of targeted attacks. I'll just give one specific example of Kazakhstan, where authorities there purchased a tool that uses deep learning to detect materials that, quote, discredit the state. And what does that mean? So all of a sudden, any kind of normal critic on social media might become one of these activists at risk of digital attacks that we're facing.
Thank you, Isabel. And there was also another question about what some countries, like what are often called like established democracies and so on can do. And during your presentation, you shared a very helpful recommendation. Let me maybe like remind the audience of some of them. But it was in terms of making sure that they restrict the export of surveillance tools, such as some of the spyware and malware tools that you mentioned, that, like Steve and Bethany also mentioned, training their own diplomatic staff to answer to these threats, as well as holding governments who are, using these digital tools for suppression of human rights and for digital repression, holding these other governments accountable. And then there are other tools that are available in terms of establishing digital hygiene clinic and providing assistance to activists who need it. From my own experience, I've noticed that this kind of support and assistance have been mostly the burden, if I can use that term, of civil society. I mean, Accessnow itself has a digital security clinic. A bunch of other organizations also provide emergency assistance, or not necessarily emergency, but assistance tips, advice to human rights activists, human rights defenders when it comes to technology, securing their communications and so on. So let me transition to this other question from the audience, asking what are the initiatives taking place globally to tackle this problem, and do private sector companies want to be part of the solution? Steve, I don't know if you have an answer to this question.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. It's a really good question, and there's a lot of ways to kind of tackle it. I want to focus on one narrow aspect to it that's a little provocative to see kind of what reactions are. So, one of the digital repression techniques I looked at, obviously we think a lot about surveillance, facial recognition, deep learning, and so forth. But one of the techniques I looked at was the use of disinformation as a means to harass, intimidate, and spread falsehoods as part of a governing strategy. And so the case study I used in my book was the Philippines and their head of state, Rodrigo Duterte, as an example of how he has systematically built up a disinformation machine that has led to the persecution of independent journalists like Maria Ressa, opposition politicians like Leila de Lima, but that Facebook itself as a platform has been a primary instrument for him to enact his repressive agenda. And so, while we focus a lot on hardware or software in terms of like spyware programs and so forth, what about the responsibility of social media platforms, particularly when they are systematically manipulated, exploited for intimidation and harassments against opposition figures in civil society? And I think to that end, we know, first of all, that there is a significant problem that has yet to be addressed in a real way, that some of the steps necessary to address those certainly lie within the responsibility of the companies themselves, and that efforts so far have really not matched the challenge of the moment, and that also there remains a sort of lack of political consensus and political will, at least in the United States, where many of these social media platforms are based, in terms of actually taking real steps to change around and reform the way these platforms are governed, so that the type of repression I mentioned can be reined in. And so I would just sort of put that out there as something that requires a much more consistent solution, where there's responsibility to go around between the social media platforms themselves, democratic regulators, as well as the actors in the countries who are exploiting these platforms. and where yet we really haven't seen the kind of progress we need to when it comes to repressive outcomes related to those activities.
Thank you, Steve. We have limited time, so I'm just going to move to another question unless one of the panelists want to chime in. No, perfect. In that case, I'm going to come to you, Bethany, because someone asked a question about, you mentioned the BuzzFeed investigation about the Uyghur camp, which actually just want to put it there. And there is a question from the audience about the Uyghur who are living in the West, because they have also been targeted. They've been targeted by troll armies to silence them and intimidate them. And so someone from the audience was asking what can be done to prevent this. And this is a technique that Isabel also mentioned during her presentation as sometimes intimidating activists to the point that they retire from activism. Is this a concern that you have?
Absolutely. And with Uyghurs specifically, I mean, Uyghurs abroad have been the target of all different kinds of attempts at repression from the Chinese government. And some of them can't really do much about. Like, for example, for several years now, public security bureaus in Xinjiang have very, very closely monitored the family members of Uyghurs in Xinjiang if they're outside of China. So, like, you know, if you're living in France or you're living in the US, police in Xinjiang will go to your family's home, you know, your relative's home, and have your relative communicate with you via probably WeChat. You know, we need this information, tell us where you work, how long you've worked there, whatever, and send this information back to us. And if you don't, then maybe your mother or your brother or your niece will be put into a camp. Also, for any Uyghur abroad, literally any Uyghur abroad with family in China, they know, and either because it's been communicated to them, or at this point, it doesn't even need to be communicated to them. They know that if they speak out, then their family members in China are likely going to experience harassment and very likely be put into a camp or into some kind of detention facility. And that's the kind of thing that, this is not really a digital problem, but there are also digital problems, or, you know, problems in the information space. And one of those was mentioned, troll campaigns. So let's just talk about social media in general. So Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, for example. And the Chinese government has used a variety of methods to certainly to go after, you know, to troll and to make online life miserable for Uyghur activists. But also have spread an enormous amount of disinformation. And so you see this being amplified by Chinese state media, the use of gray zone actors, you know, so this is like disreputable websites and organizations that will publish supposed, you know, debunking articles about the camps in Xinjiang. And this huge disinformation ecosystem has sprung up on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. And those companies have done almost nothing about it. It's a really simple fix. It's not hard. They should take down content that denies genocide and is supported either explicitly or complicitly by the Chinese government, that is specifically for the purpose of making it more difficult to push back against actual genocide. This is not hard. And yet we've seen over and over again from Twitter and from Facebook and from YouTube an enormous reluctance at the, you know, company executive level to deal with disinformation at all. They will say it's not our business, it's not our business, not our business. And when it comes to the US, I mean, it took literally an insurrection at the US Capitol for them to kind of take some of this stuff seriously. I don't know it'll make them take it seriously when it comes to, you know, genocide in China. If your company, if you're using free speech, if you're abusing and the excuse of free speech to keep this content up on your platform because you don't want to be legally liable, or really because you don't want to put in the resources, i.e. money, into policing it. I mean, they're a huge part of the problem, and a main reason that disinformation about the camps and disinformation targeting individual people. So Adrian Zenz, a German researcher, Vicky Xiuzhong-Xu in Australia, who has written a report about forced labor in Xinjiang, and most certainly Uyghurs themselves have come under attack, you know, from this kind of disinformation. You know, this stuff needs to be taken down, and it's not being taken down. So that would be a very obvious recommendation.
Thank you very much, Bethany. And just as a follow-up to what you've just said, I'd like to mention a UN report actually that looked specifically into this when it came to Myanmar, for example, and coming to the conclusion that Facebook in particular had played a part in violence and in the killing of Rohingya population in Myanmar. So I think as much as we talk about, like the authoritarian countries and, Steve, you also mentioned the weak democracies and how they can either imitate, but also, flex their own authoritarian muscles. It's important to hold companies accountable. And I know that it's not always easy to find a solution that fits all, because it very much depends of the context in each country. But Bethany, you also mentioned resources. And it's true that when it comes to, like localizing solutions, even when it comes to, content governance, content moderation requires, translation, having moderators who are familiar not just with the language, but also with the context, and they can make proper assessment of, incitement to violence and other forms of dangerous speech online. We've got a question about Turkey, for example, and about Turkey hiring local staff as national representatives. And it's interesting because civil society has been asking private companies to make those local hires sometimes in order to have people who are familiar with the context and can support decision-making in the companies. But the other side of the coin, according to this question, is also that sometimes there can be pressure on these local staff and turn them into almost informants on behalf of the state, and have access to information that could lead to people being arrested and pressuring companies to report on dissidents. Isabel, is this something? How can we solve this situation? Because we definitely need the local context, but is there a threat when we localize solution to have them switched and become counterproductive?
Well, I don't know if I can propose a whole solution in just the couple minutes we have left, but I'm really glad somebody asked this question, because it is a huge trend, I think, that we're starting to see and need to watch for. We kind of call them, you may call them hostage-taking laws, or provisions like that, where if a tech company has people in the country that is requesting the tech company to do something, that provides an extra incentive on top of that financial incentive that Bethany's talked about, that we know is there. So in addition to the financial incentive for a tech company to comply with the government's request, there's now the fact that they are actually responsible for the physical well-being of people who work for them. And Turkey is not the only place where we're worried about this. Actually, just today, some news came out about this in India, where we've seen a prolonged kind of back and forth between the government and Twitter, including with threatening to arrest Twitter employees earlier this year. But the news today was that Twitter now has lost safe harbor protections in India. So it can now be held liable for content that users post under Indian law. And so that's apparently in response to Twitter not adhering to India's no rules. And so these are kind of all of a piece, I think, that governments are figuring out ways to basically hang incentives over tech companies. And, Melody's point about the need for understanding local context in the decisions that tech companies have made, I think really points to kind of the perverse nature of this, that governments are really turning the requests of activists and people who care about these issues around and kind of manipulating them to their own gain. So yeah, in sum, I think that this is absolutely something to keep watching. And, I have certainly more sympathy for understanding why this is a challenging decision for for tech companies. You know, we can point to the economic incentives in one hand, but when they're having to make decisions that have implications for the lives of people who work for them, that all of a sudden, from kind of my human rights perspective, becomes a lot more challenging and something I have a lot more trouble coming down on one way or the other. So I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, and that will be the last word from our panel, because we're coming to time. I was really honored and privileged to have this discussion with the three of you. I personally learned a lot, and I'm working in this field, and looking at the questions that were coming in, I'm sure that the people who were watching and following this conversation also learned. Please keep the conversation going. I know that there is still a lot of engagement via the hashtag RightsCity. And I'm sure that any of the panelists, a lot of the material was also shared in the chat and online. And I'm sure that we'll continue this chat. So thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Bethany. Thank you very much, Isabel. And thank you to the organizers of RightsCity for providing the space for this conversation.
Thank you, Melody, for doing an amazing job moderating. Steve, Isabel, and Bethany, thank you so much. We'll get this online soon so people can watch it again. Please share it. And I just want to tell everyone watching, this is the end of day 2 of Right City, but tomorrow we're going to be having 2 panels. One is on moving to unite democracies on tech, with a really interesting group of people from the National Endowment for Democracy, from IREX, from the Global Public Policy Institute, and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, followed by then a discussion on using social media as a tool to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes, with people from Bellingcat, University of California, Berkeley, and as well as from the University of Ottawa. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.